Welcome to Hash It Out, a podcast built by data security experts. We decipher the data security landscape through honest conversations about today's headlines and tomorrow's challenges. Brought to you by Virtru. Let's dive in. Today, we're talking with Navroop Mitter, CEO of Armortext, about the Salt Typhoon breach, its impact on telecom security, and why end-to-end encryption matters.
Good afternoon. My name is Matt Howard. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Virtru, and I have the pleasure today of hosting Navroop Mitter, CEO of Armortext, an old friend and a longtime colleague. Navroop, welcome to Hash It Out.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we start, if you don't mind, tell us just a little bit about yourself, your company, and kind of what you guys do.
Yeah, so look, I'm a reformed cybersecurity consultant who thankfully made a switch from the dark side over to product companies. And we built a company called Armortext, which provides secure out-of-band collaboration. We particularly focus on critical infrastructure companies who have a reason to want to better protect their incident response, security ops, and threat intelligence sharing communications with things like end-to-end encryption, but also the means to have those better protective communications while staying compliant with their regulatory requirements.
Interesting. So, we had a chance, you and I have known each other a long time, caught up over coffee a couple of weeks ago, and we were both kind of comparing notes on, sort of the news flow, which at the time was hot and heavy with respect to Salt Typhoon and all things Kalia and the backdoors, and it was not lost on you or myself when the FBI and CISA came out with what seemed to be, for the first time ever, really explicit guidance to, U.S. citizens and companies, presumably, to embrace end-to-end encryption in light of the, active threat posed by the Salt Typhoon hack on the U.S. telecom carriers. At that moment, what was going through your mind when you first heard about it? I'm sure, this is something near and dear to your heart, but what went through your mind when you first heard about Salt Typhoon? And then second, what did you think when you first saw what the FBI and CISA had to say?
Well, when I first heard about Salt Typhoon, one of my immediate concerns was how would this affect both individuals and consumers in the telcos, but also the enterprise clients, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of doubt that got created immediately as to whether or not we could trust the telecom networks when having to communicate about certain security incidents. Absolutely made sense. But when I saw the FBI and CISA guidance, the first thought was, oh, wow, they've finally come around and are accepting that there is value to end-to-end encryption. This is something that more recently we've seen happen in the EU as well, where their latest laws around NIS2 made explicit mention of the value of end-to-end encryption and the need to not weaken it, despite what law enforcement and others had said previously. And so my first reaction was perhaps finally the FBI and CISA have come around. And then I actually read the guidance itself. And my next thought was, oh, wow, this guidance read on its own without care for what are other obligations you might have as either someone who works for government or works in a regulated sector, is that following this guidance as is without consideration of those other obligations could land you in a lot of hot water later on, particularly around your obligation to retain certain communications, right? If you're in banking, for example, you've got records retention requirements that are incumbent upon you. We've most recently seen fines levied starting back in, I think it was December of 2021, when JP Morgan was fined some $200 million for failure to having been able to produce records that they were required to keep of communications that took place like WhatsApp or Signal during that time period. Fast forward a few years, that number has now reached 3 billion. So the second thought was literally following this advice as is could really land you in hot water.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was interesting talking to you because, at Virtru, we had, I would say, a similar but different reaction to the whole Salt Typhoon thing. And as you may have seen in some of the news media that John Ackerley, our CEO, was quoted in, he was, as a former Bush White House policy advisor, near and dear to his heart was kind of privacy and concerns with respect to, government mandated backdoors and telecom networks to, enable legal, lawful surveillance with a warrant from a judge. The the thing that kind of immediately struck us was like, this was bound to happen. I mean, these backdoors that were implemented into the carrier networks kind of go back to 1994 with Kalia. They subsequently expanded. I mean, and I think at some level it's tricky because everybody understands the desire to have these backdoors there to enable legal surveillance when some law enforcement person goes and gets a warrant from a judge. That makes sense. But it also is, I think, fairly obvious to most people, like experts, including yourself, that when you have these backdoors implemented for purposes of supporting law enforcement, it's a very short step to a place where those same backdoors might be exploited by, bad actors for nefarious purposes. Was that your view?
100%. Look, a robber doesn't always come through the front door. Sometimes they come through the patio door as well, right? If there's a door there, they're going to make use of it.
Right.
And I think one of the interesting things that I've seen over the years is this notion that we could somehow create a golden key, this
Right.
golden key that only the good guys could use.
Right.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe it was the Xbox signing key at some point that was stolen effectively by a bunch of teenagers, right? I might have the video game platform wrong, but the golden signing key specific to making sure that their hardware to only run authenticated games was stolen by effectively kids, right, who pulled off this interesting heist. And when you look at the details of it, you realize that even with billions of dollars on the line, these large companies were unable to protect what would be the equivalent to that golden key. And now here we're saying, hey, this isn't a key that would affect your bottom line at all, but we want you as a telecom or messaging or other provider to take responsibility and somehow protect this better than everyone else who had economic incentives has been able to do up until now.
Right. And so what would, sorry, keep going if you have another thought.
No, I was just going to say, it just doesn't make sense to try to, keep pushing that narrative when we see time and time again, it just fails.
So do me a favor, kind of, if you can, connect the dots between what you and I both observed and the rest of the world, quite frankly, especially those that were paying close attention to the Salt Typhoon news breaking, the subsequent announcement from the FBI and CISA about, hey, it's probably a good idea that people, start embracing end-to-end encryption because we don't know if the Chinese state actors, Salt Typhoon folks, are still in the network. We don't know when they're going to be evicted. And, security and privacy right now for sensitive information is paramount. So it's probably worth embracing end-to-end encryption capabilities. I'm curious to just kind of have you comment on why end-to-end encryption and, the implications of that versus something like historically transport layer security, TLS, or something like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something we talk about frequently with our customers, right? Transport layer security protects my communications between my device and the server that is now going to be then disseminating that information further. At the point of it hitting that server or the network layer right before it, what I transmitted over the internet is transformed back into plain text. The simplest example of this is I want to go to AmericanAirlines.com. I need to buy a ticket. I don't necessarily want everyone else to intercept my information over the internet, but American on its servers absolutely needs to be able to see that information. And from there, they might need to further transmit it to other parties, and they'll again apply transport layer security at that point. But in the middle there, on their servers, they absolutely needed my information in order to be able to issue me that ticket. When it comes to communications, end-to-end encryption, the whole point of it is to ensure that that server that's helping with the dissemination of that information or propagating it to the recipients, the people that you want to communicate with, itself can never read those communications, right? And that's where that privacy angle that Ackerley and others were talking about comes in. From a consumer standpoint, absolutely. Signal, WhatsApp, end-to-end encrypted communications totally makes sense. That CISA and the FBI have started to warm up to it makes sense. But even if we look very closely at what they said, they technically said responsible end-to-end encryption, which from their perspective still means one that is somehow both end-to-end encrypted, but has a backdoor that if they wanted to, they could ask you to use, right? And so,
yeah, but certainly that was the implication. I think that there, for a number of folks in the industry, ourselves included, we saw the word responsible as part of the, written formal guidance. And it certainly raised our radar with respect to, what do you mean responsible? Does that mean use something that by definition is supported with a backdoor today so that they can continue to have access through, warrants and legal methods to conduct surveillance? Because if that's the case, I think that makes sense. I don't necessarily know what exactly still, as I sit here today talking to you, what they meant by responsible. That's all I can surmise. I don't know if you got any further formal clarification or saw anything from them on that.
We actually did see one comment, and I've been trying to find the link again, right? So we saw something briefly that had been online, and I believe it was from CISA itself that helped better define the responsible component. And it very much alluded to the fact that ideally, a responsible encryption would still be one that would be able to allow you to work with law enforcement should the need arise. Um, that said, the examples they gave of what technologies you should go use definitely don't meet that definition, at least if you were to believe all the analysis that's been done up to date on how well Signal and WhatsApp have implemented the ratcheting protocol for end-to-end encryption.
Well, and this is where I think we want to take the conversation, because the question is, how can, in your case, certainly Virtue's case too, I think, we're kindred spirits in the sense that we both believe that privacy and security with respect to sensitive information is paramount to, the world we live in, to the customers we serve. I think end-to-end encryption in the true sense is the best practice. And neither one of us is naive about the idea that end-to-end encryption can be done in a way that supports a business requirement so that their security and privacy is enhanced above and beyond what's possible with just TLS only, and in a manner where, should they have certain requirements like audit or regulatory requirements, if they were SEC regulated or something else, could still be met. Is that your view?
100%. Look, both of our companies are geared towards enterprises. And so we take it very seriously when customers tell us they need user management, they need policy enforcement, they need remediation controls. But above and all else, they also need, alongside that end-to-end encryption, the ability to maintain their business records retention requirements.
Right.
Because the SEC and CFTC weren't joking around when they issued 3 billion fines, right? If we think about even the DOJ and the FTC, they first issued guidance back, I think, in 2023 around ephemeral messaging and letting you know that if you had an obligation to preserve records for whatever reason, that obligation can continue to exist. They further clarified that in 2024. And so that's where I also look at this guidance from the CISA and the FBI and say, well, this is potentially contradictory towards the guidance that was issued by DOJ and FTC. I mean, most recently,
potentially it is contradictory. I mean, it's incongruent, is it not?
It is absolutely incongruent, right? The FTC has literally gone after Amazon's executives for its use of Signal because of the spoliation of data, right? There are a number of cases in which either the FTC or the DOJ or the SEC, CFTC, and now other bodies are starting to look at your requirements to have preserved an audit trail for various reasons and saying, well, if you can't do it, we're no longer going to give you a mulligan when you get to court, right? We're going to take a serious look at the practices you had. Is this something that happened unbeknownst to you, or is this something you had tacitly approved along the way? They're going to want to know that you had done it responsibly. Responsible in this case, though, doesn't necessarily have to be that the provider has access to the data. Like in both of our cases, both of our companies are built in such a way that we don't necessarily have access to the data, but instead we empower the enterprise to once again have control of their own data and ownership of their own data, right? You can have end-to-end encryption. They can hold the ability to decrypt, while we as a provider, any of our partners, suppliers, or vendors would be unable to decrypt their communications.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, when we look at it from the perspective of, it's your data. You should be the one to have the key. You should be the one to make the decision on whether you want to decrypt it or not. No one else should make that decision. And if you should find yourself, faced with some law enforcement official, equipped with a warrant asking you to decrypt the data, well, then you would make the decision to decrypt. But it's certainly a very different world when you can imagine if you were an iPhone user and you had very sensitive information backed up to your iCloud backup, and some law enforcement person went to Apple and said, hey, we'd like you to do me a favor, please. I've got a warrant here, decrypt Nivrup's iCloud backup for me. And the complications of that are sort of well known to, I think, the world at large, at least, again, the folks that are paying really close attention. I just want to play this back to you, though, because this is kind of like, when I talk about, like, it's fundamentally incongruent, I mean, like, sometimes I just have to, like, I live here in Washington, D.C. I read the news, I go to work, I come home. Sometimes I just have to stop and I have to think to myself, holy crap, like, here we are living in this world where CALIA requires carriers to have backdoors so we can do legal law enforcement. That makes sense. We then realize, matter of fact, that those backdoors were exploited by Chinese state hackers, and they are now in U.S. telecom carrier networks and doing things like spying on both presidential candidates. That's a fact. We are concerned about it, appropriately so, federal law enforcement, FBI and CISA. We can't exactly tell the public when the threat is going to be mitigated or when it's going to be over. So in that light, they say, hey, it's probably a good idea to now embrace end-to-end encryption. And again, that's very sensible coming from the government, in terms of guidance to consumers or citizens. It makes a ton of sense. Maybe even guidance to federal law enforcement employees or federal employees who might be subject to particular, surveillance from the Chinese who are now in the network. I guess where it kind of struck me as a little bit of a misfire was on this whole idea that people like in the banking industry could look at that guidance from CISA and the FBI and take it on its face and start to embrace something like Signal, only to find themselves sidewards with their regulators.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think part of the challenge is the guidance that was issued lacked nuance and detail, right? Instead of saying as a blanket statement, we should all be looking at end-to-end encryption, they should have been saying, here's the kinds of end-to-end encryption that are rightly applicable to your life in different circumstances. I have a private life that is very different from my enterprise life as the CEO of a company, right? Or as someone who works in federal law enforcement. In my private life, do I want a Signal or a WhatsApp because I do not want some sort of backdoor into my personal and private communications? 100%, absolutely. As an enterprise, though, do I recognize that I have an obligation to various records retention requirements or more broadly enterprise controls around user management policy enforcement? Absolutely. So the solution that was built for me in my consumer life is not necessarily the solution for me in my enterprise life. Well, if I'm a federal law enforcement person, I mean, I know it sounds like the guidance makes sense, right? They're
Right.
high value targets. This is
On the
guidance.
surface, it's sensible, sure.
Well, it is and it isn't, right? It is in that, yes, end-to-end encryption is sensible, but the guidance as issued failed to even acknowledge that you might still have a retention requirement. If we think back to, I believe it was 2019 when the news broke, but it was probably 2018 in which Jared Kushner, during President Trump's first term in office, had an ongoing set of communications with the Saudis, and in particular, Mohammed bin Salman, right? MBS. Those communications, if I'm not mistaken, took place over WhatsApp. And at the time, folks rightly called out that this violated, I believe it's the Presidential Records Act, right? The PRA. And, later someone had to clarify that, no, some appropriate screenshots had been delivered, but there was no way of knowing for certain whether or not all records were kept or whether or not any classified intelligence had been delivered across that channel that perhaps hadn't made its way into a screenshot, something that then we would not necessarily know about, right? It goes back to like using a personal email server. If you start to use tools that are meant for your personal life for work reasons, your enterprise may rightfully say, hey, wait a minute, we don't necessarily know what it is you're communicating about when it comes to work on this personal system. We want you to switch back to some enterprise approved platform. The same is true for government, right? There are Freedom of Information Act related requirements. There's PRA. There are a number of other requirements that they also have for records retention, despite being high value targets.
Right. Yeah. And so, I know, like you, I mean, I'm talking to a lot of enterprise organizations every day about, their concerns and their view of how do I protect sensitive data that we have inside the business that we know we have to share externally. We can't run this business without sharing sensitive data. How do we do that in a way where it's secure, where our privacy is maintained, and in a way where we aren't subject to unintended risk that might now be present because the Chinese have exploited our carrier networks? And oh, by the way, how can I do it in a manner where my compliance people aren't freaked out because I might no longer be compliant with federal regulatory regimes, which I'm responsible for? And I mean, in a nutshell, that's kind of the conversation we've seen playing out. And certainly, I don't want to make this all about, Armortext or all about Virtru, but sometimes in the world we live in, you see a situation like this come to fruition where it's like, yeah, this is why companies like, Armortext and companies like Virtru exist. is to provide, good governance, good control over sensitive information, do it in a way where it supports the enterprise requirement, do it in a way where it still gives you the ability to maintain compliance with regulatory regimes, and perhaps, in its simplest form, do in a way that's secure and private. Would you agree?
100%. Look, I mean, I think this is the right time to go back and reconsider, especially with the enterprise side, what we would call a tier and protect strategy, right? Ripping and replacing all of your internal and external communication systems with something hyper secure just because there's this potential ability to read those communications might be overkill in certain
Sure.
circumstances, right? You want
Probably
to
not, probably not feasible in terms of time and money.
Absolutely. But you want to right size to which use cases truly warrant that additional layer of protection, such that if an adversary were to get a hold of them, is this information that might, inform some sort of industrial espionage campaign? Or is this something that might inform an attacker as to how to better stay resident within your systems? And that's kind of why we focus on use cases like incident response or security operations. You're oftentimes discussing things in those details there, like what your negotiation strategy is going to be to a threat actor is now demanding a ransom. If the threat actor can watch that conversation and knows that you're authorized to go up to 10 and you try to lowball them with one, at some point, like Ragnar Locker did years ago to a French retail company, they're going to say, actually, we're in control here. We know and can see and are listening to your strategy. Here's a screenshot of your internal communications and chat for the whole world to see so that you now know that you actually have to pay us the 10. You want to right size these things, right? And so you have use cases that we absolutely all understand and recognize are highly sensitive. Threat intelligence sharing is a form of external communication where organizations rely on each other, but in order to really rely on each other and best pass on information about the potential threat, what things to look for, what strategies they may or may not be employing themselves, or what has actually already hit, they need to be able to discuss things in detail and nuance. And that requires having a greater amount of trust in the platform itself. And that then requires additional security, both trust in the platform then, but also then trust in the identities. So you're also looking at who are the identities on this platform. Are they well vetted, or is this just whoever's phone number got added to the chat 5 minutes ago, right? And that's, again, why this discussion actually has to go beyond just end-to-end encryption.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Well, it was great to see you a couple of weeks ago in person. I enjoyed that conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed this one here today, and I'm glad we were able to kind of, compare notes, on the record for the benefit of folks that happen to watch Hash It Out. I think your view of this landscape is expert and is well informed as anybody I know, and we're grateful for you taking the time to come in and chat with us today. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll catch up with you next time.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a 5-star review and don't miss us the next time we hash it out. Like, follow, and subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, all linked below.